Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2009 Hoffman Scholars Talk. My name is Claire Brown, class of 1994, and I'm the chair of the Alumni Council's Committee on Academic Programs for Alumni, also known as CAPA. The Hoffman Scholars Program was created by CAPA as a new annual distinction and event designed to highlight the scholarly work of late-stage Princeton graduate students who have distinguished themselves with original work of the highest quality, and to share this work with the entire community of Princeton alumni, students, and friends. This distinction has been named in honor of Robert Hoffman, graduate class of '58, a dedicated Princeton alumnus. Bob was regarded as one of the nicest and most thoughtful of graduates, dependable, upbeat, and always helpful. Valedictorian of Riverside High School, Bob received a bachelor's degree from Drexel University in 1957, his MSc from Princeton in 1958, and a Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania in 1967, all in chemical engineering. In industry, he continued his academic research in the thermodynamics of polymers. Bob was not only an officer and executive committee member of the Association of Princeton Graduate Alumni, but was also an Alumni Council executive committee member and longstanding member of and source of energy and ideas for CAPA. Although spending less time as a student at Princeton than any of his other alma maters, Tiger Hoff considered Princeton his home. He was a champion of integrating graduate students and graduate alumni more fully into the Princeton fold, and was a strong supporter of alumni education at Princeton. A proud P-Raid Marshal and a flanking Marshal, he attended some 50 Princeton events in his last decade. We are pleased to confer the distinction of Hoffman Scholar to the following students who are with us today: Daniel Bouk from the History Department and the program in History of Science, Levi McLaughlin from the Religion Department, and Intisar Rab from Near Eastern Studies. It is my further pleasure today to introduce William B. Russell, the Arthur W. Marks Class of 19 Professor of Chemical Engineering and Dean of the Graduate School. Dean Russell has been a member of the Princeton faculty since 1974. He has a long history of service to the university in various capacities, including serving as a chair of the Department of Chemical Engineering from 1987 to 1996, and of course assuming the reins in the graduate school in August of 2002. The recipient of many awards and honors himself, including appointments to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering, Dean Russell is the perfect person to kick off our Hoffman Scholars presentation. Dean Russell.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. In the interest of trying to say something interesting, I thought I would comment a little bit on current events. Some of you may have read a couple weeks ago the op-ed in the New York Times that was entitled, "End of the University as We Know It." This was criticizing graduate education in general, with an emphasis on the humanities. And while the article has some elements of truth in it, in many ways his description just doesn't square with my view of graduate education, and particularly the humanities at Princeton. So I thought I would give you a couple of examples where I think we don't follow or led by what he says. First of all, he says, American universities produce a product for which there is no market, i.e. candidates for teaching positions that do not exist, and develop skills for which there is diminishing demand. Certainly, the competition for academic positions even for our graduates has become increasingly competitive in past years, and seriously more so during the current fiscal crisis. On the other hand, the new administration in Washington is putting funding behind its recognition for the need of highly educated individuals to help the United States recover, and not just in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field. Furthermore, when I go on the road to meet graduate alumni, I frequently meet alumni from the humanities who have had very satisfying careers for themselves outside of the academy. And I'm not just talking about the two biotech CEOs who got PhDs in religion. Another statement he made was, as departments fragment, research and publication become more and more about less and less. At Princeton, even a dean who's an engineer can recognize dissertations in the humanities that are very ambitious in scope and have implications for modern life, public policy, and understanding deeper understanding of the world around us. More often than these very narrow perspectives that he put forth, I find students who transcend disciplinary boundaries, such as Gerard Passanante in English several years ago, who reached out to Tony Grafton in history and Leonard Barkin in comp lit for his advisors. So I think we're going to hear more of this today. I think the humanities at Princeton are healthy, alive, and thriving, and I'm very happy to be the dean that has them under his purview. This is also an opportunity to honor Robert Hoffman, who I did know as an alumnus years ago before I became dean, and to hear from accomplished scholars who have their own unique talents and will further illustrate the strength of graduate education at Princeton. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Russell, for highlighting the importance of graduate research to the Princeton community and to our nation and world at large. My name is Leslie Rowley, and I'm the Associate Director for Alumni Education at the Alumni Association. And in organizing this event to honor graduate scholarship and promote it to the entire Princeton community, CAPA, the Committee on Academic Programs for Alumni within the Alumni Council, has worked with the Alumni Council's Graduate Alumni Relations Committee and Labyrinth Books of Princeton. Thank you to all of the organizations who have contributed time and resources toward today's event. And now I'm pleased to introduce Daniel Bouk. Dan Bouk hails from upstate New York, and to upstate New York he will soon return. He grew up in Rochester, New York, and did his undergraduate work at Michigan State University. Wanting to keep his options open, he pursued a degree in a major that he thought would offer him the most flexibility in years to come, computational mathematics. After completing his BS in 2002, Dan taught for 2 years in a Cincinnati elementary school through AmeriCorps until he could no longer stand being outside of a university. In 2004, he began at Princeton, this time in the History of Science program. Vestiges of his mathematical past persist in Dan's choice to focus his research at Princeton on science in the American life insurance industry. A 2009 recipient of the Porter Ogden Jacobus Fellowship, Dan will complete his PhD this summer before beginning as an assistant professor teaching U.S. history at Colgate University. With a talk entitled Taking Risks and Defining Difference in the American Life Insurance Industry, Daniel Bouk.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight, this afternoon. I appreciate you coming to listen to me talk, and I want to thank CAPA as well for giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about my research into the American life insurance industry. Today, I hope to use these 15 minutes to sketch out for you fairly briefly some of the work that I've done, and particularly try to convince you that studying life insurance can in fact speak to a set of very important questions in the history of social and human sciences, and to American intellectual and cultural history more generally. Now, we're going to focus in particular today on questions of how one defines human differences, how one determines what differences might matter most. And this is related to questions of classification and questions of discrimination. We'll think about classification in this sense as being the choosing of categories which can then be used to group individuals, and discrimination as a sort of application of classification, such that then groups of people will then be treated differently based on the groupings you've made from those criteria. You might ask now why to pair this industry with these questions. Well, in fact, classification and discrimination were crucial to the tradition of commercial life insurance as it has been born in the United Kingdom in the mid-18th century, and as it was transplanted in the United States in the early 19th century. As one writer put it in 1866 for a small company called the American Popular Life, is not classing risks the pith of insurance? And sure enough, it was for almost all commercial companies in the United States in the mid-19th century. Most companies had at least 2 stages of classification for all applicants. First, a person applied for insurance, and they were either excluded or included in the company. This is the first sorting mechanism. The second was, once a person was let into an insurance company, they were classed according to their age at entry. So fairly standard even now. If you are younger, you are then discriminated insofar as you are paying a lower premium, and if you are older at age of entry, you will be paying a higher premium. This is a very simple form of discrimination and classification. This same prospectus from the American Popular Life went on to posit the, again, rhetorical question, is not that company best that classes best? Now, for the historian, it might be more interesting to ask, what counts as classing best? And the answer is going to be, it depends, or more precisely, it depended. What I'm going to posit for you today is that by looking at the ways in which this question has been answered, we can get some insight into how the life insurance industry helped us to think in different ways about these questions of defining human difference, about classification, and about discrimination. And ultimately, I think we can see that the life insurance industry creates a unique definition of human difference, that these life insurance thinkers say that the differences that matter could vary with time, context, and place, but ultimately they had to lead to higher rates of mortality among a group that they were applied to. And in this way, thinkers in the life insurance industry define human difference as being essentially equivalent to risk. So now, for the rest of this talk, we're going to look at two documents. And from these documents, I hope to show some of these changes that have gone on in the American life insurance industry in regards to how these questions about how to class best have been answered. And as we're doing it, we'll have the added bonus of being able to briefly engage with some of the changing pictures of risk in America. We're going to start in the mid-19th century with an actual picture of the United States. This was printed by the Mutual Life of New York. This was one of the largest life insurance companies in the United States for most of the 19th century. This was distributed in its 1858 annual report. Similar maps were distributed in a number of other annual reports. This is a fair representation of a common mid-19th century classification system used by a number of companies, largely replicating the system pioneered by the Mutual of New York. Here, the company is still classifying by age of entry, as with most companies, but also is now classifying by these large regional classes. So here we have Class 1, which would be the Northeast, including, interestingly enough, Virginia. Class 2 is the Northwest. Both of these classes, members who applied for life insurance from these areas were allowed in on basic terms. This was the norm or the ideal applicant. Those coming from the southern seacoast in Class 3 were charged an extra penalty. Those coming from the west in Class 5 were charged double that penalty. And those coming from the Cotton South, the Deep South, were charged double that penalty again. At some level, this picture should not be particularly surprising. This is a picture of risk that is drawn by a northern company at the height of sectional tension before the Civil War. Section was indeed, if not the most, it was probably the most important category at the moment in many people's minds. And to penalize most heavily the Cotton South would have been, to do anything otherwise would have been surprising. This classificatory system was shaped by the Board of Trustees of the Mutual of New York in cooperation with two mathematicians. The first, here, Charles Gill, was a Londoner transplanted to New York. He was a mathematical problem solver of some note, and the first mathematician in the United States to work with a company by doing a regional analysis, using these kind of regional classifications to determine differential rates of mortality in various places, and then to convince the Board of Trustees to use those differential rates in setting the extra premiums that would be charged. It's worth noting that when the Board of Trustees and Gill explained why it was that the Cotton South had such poor mortality rates, such high mortality rates, and why they were being charged such a large extra, they did not point, as we might today, to this being a pestilential region or an area plagued by malaria, but pinned this largely on the slave system and the kind of political economy that followed the slave system. Gill died suddenly in 1855, and was replaced by Shepard Homans. He was much younger than Gill, born in Baltimore to a prominent banking family. He went to Harvard, and then he got to take his mathematical skills for a ride as an astronomer for the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, helping to survey the new route for the Transcontinental Railroad that would be coming in the next decades. Homans was, perhaps unsurprisingly, an advocate for the West. Not that he didn't know the dangers of the West. While he was doing his surveying work, his commander and half of his survey team were killed in a battle with Ute warriors. But the promise for Homans of the railroad to come and the civilizing influences that he thought would come with that railroad led him to advocate for decreasing these extra rates in the West, even before the mortality rates had shown perhaps sufficient movement towards lessening to justify such a move. Now, let's pull back to this general picture. What comes through clearly is that this category of section is very important, and it remained that way really through the 1880s and 1890s, although it began to lose its grasp sometime in the 1870s. In particular, with the panic of 1873, the life insurance companies were hurt very badly. They were hurt, in fact, much worse than they would be 60 years later during the Great Depression, and were in desperate need of new sources of revenue and new policyholders, and were willing to look in many, many places for this. With the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the South suddenly became more appealing to many of these northern capitalists, and many, like the Mutual of New York's president, Frederick Winston, led the way in, it led a kind of movement towards national reconciliation, beginning by removing regional rates and essentially abolishing this regional picture of risk that is shown in this map throughout the 1880s and 1890s. We're going to jump to our second document now, and this is going to take us to the turn of the 20th century. This next document comes from 1903. This is a page from a special investigation of mortality records conducted by the Actuarial Society of America, a newly formed professional organization of actuaries in the United States, and drawn from records from most American companies. It presents a very different sort of picture than the one we've just been looking at. This is one in which risk and human difference is a much more diverse and complicated problem. We're not just dealing with age or section here. Now we are dealing with, in this particular document, 98 classes of risks. And later documents would number in the hundreds in terms of these classes of risk. We can break them down helpfully into a few groups to help us see what the new picture of risk at this turn of the 20th century is going to be begins to look like. There were some vestiges of the old sectional system, at least place still mattered. Here, looking at place of residence, we've got a number of counties, mainly in the South, but this is still a far cry from the kind of map we've just been looking at that covered the entire United States. We've now limited this to 20 counties as potential areas of risk. Much more important was the question of race. Beginning in the 1880s, companies began to discriminate by race, particularly against African Americans. This is a major movement from dealing with section and region to beginning to be concerned with race. But legislatures fought back in the particularly 1890s. A number of northern state legislatures barred discrimination based solely on color. And the companies responded in a number of ways. These northern legislatures were where most of these companies were based, so it was a very effective legislation. Many companies responded to having their option to discriminate taken away by deciding to simply abandon black business entirely. And others found ways to disguise their racial discrimination through the other 97 forms of possible classification that were listed in these tables, thus being able to still discriminate, but in a way that would make it less obviously so for racial purposes. Regardless of which path a company took, though, there were companies from both of these groups who supported, in the end, extensive studies of African American health and mortality to support and justify their particular actions. So oddly enough, the industry became a center for studying African American health and mortality rates throughout much of the early 20th century. Now, if we look on the left-hand side, we see a long column of various occupations listed in this particular classification system. Now, in this study in 1903, the actuaries determined some occupations were healthier than they had perhaps anticipated. Electricians, iron workers, they labeled good risks based on the experience of previously insured electricians and iron workers in American companies. Yet they found many that were very bad risks. Steel grinders, glass workers, anyone that had anything to do with liquor, and then anyone who had the word railway in them here. So a wide variety of people considered to be very bad risks by these companies. As time went on, the American life insurance industry became even more expert in its knowledge of the American industry generally. Later companies would produce significantly more expansive pamphlets than this, which would list basically every possible occupation and include a verdict on the healthfulness or potential risks associated with that occupation. If nothing else, we can say the risk in this picture is taking on a much more industrial flavor. It also was taking on a much more overtly medical character. In some ways, this was through obvious means, as through diseases we can readily look at and say, that sounds like a disease: asthma, gout, syphilis. But as medical directors began to look for ways to select better risks or to have a better idea of who the good risks would be, and as they wanted more ways in which to discriminate amongst applicants who were kind of borderline, people who you might allow in, you might not want to allow in, they tried to find less obvious criteria. One of the most important for us now today is what we might call build or height-weight ratios, later body mass index, or as it appears in this document early on, a set of weight classes, each paired with then some other kind of anthropometric measurements or particularly family histories. And this points us to the origin of these weight classes, concerned not mainly to begin with overweight, but particularly with underweight, looking for people who might be not particularly heavy and that thus be showing signs of tuberculosis or a latent tuberculosis. Now, the companies went on to do many more studies on build, as well as a number of other things that would become to be called impairments and then later risk factors, like blood pressure or urine analysis. Obesity or high blood pressure are now common disease concepts, but they weren't at this moment. And in large part, the reason we think of them now as disease concepts is because of the work of these doctors, actuaries, and statisticians who were very well connected to a network of doctors around the nation and to the burgeoning public health movement. If we can step back again, the picture that emerges from this document, these classes of risks, should look a little bit familiar. It's actually very similar to at least one picture of risk and human difference that still prevails in the US today. I'm going to close now, and I hope that you've enjoyed this little sketch of my project, and I hope that I've convinced you that it's worth our historical effort to pay some attention to the life insurance industry as a site for the production of important scientific and cultural work in American history. Thank you.
Were slaves actually covered by life insurance? Could they get life insurance?
Yes. Well, it worked a little bit differently. So throughout most of so long as they were slaves, they were first covered as commodities. So in fact, before there was extensive life insurance in the United States, among most individuals, there were more slaves who were being insured through marine insurers. Later on, there were life insurance companies, strict life insurance companies, that also would insure slaves. They would most likely be slaves who had a skilled trade, worked in urban areas, and were valuable for that reason. That's probably it.
Is that a digressive list?
No, it's the numbers in no way, they're not indicative of anything.
Can I was wondering, oh, okay. I didn't see anything on the list about gender, about women at all.
Right. Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, this list is drawn from mainly men. The life insurance industry throughout most of the 19th century sold very few policies to women. They gathered a fair amount of data on female mortality because they sold many policies that would have women as beneficiaries, and particularly endowments, where how long a woman would live would matter. So they had a general idea that most women lived longer than men. But most people within the industry thought that they could not select women well. And there were a number of theories they had for why this was, that Victorian medical regimes would not allow a kind of invasive medical exam in a way that would allow one to figure out whether or not a woman was hiding a sickness, or that women, especially married women, would be colluding with their husbands to defraud the company. In fact, later work suggests that none of these were actual problems. It was more a small numbers problem, that they had insured so few people, so few women, that they had a bad experience by chance.
So one might conclude from the progression here that when it was by area, by section, this could be a mail order business. I guess the question is, when did the life insurance salesman come into it?
Right. The Mutual of New York is among the group of companies that began in the 1840s, and in part was so popular because they employed agents. So the agency system it was begun in around the 1840s. So that was started in the 1840s. And in fact, part of the reason these mathematicians are involved in the first place is that the companies have to justify to their agents in the South, in the Deep South, for having these very high penalties, which are so high, in fact, as to basically make buying a life insurance from the Mutual of New York if you live in Texas just a horrible idea. These are very heavy penalties. And agents, of course, don't like not getting any business because of horrible terms.
You mentioned regulation that impinged on race as risk. Were there other legislative restraints on what a company could do in terms of risk?
There would be, I think, in fact, there become many more kind of after my dissertation ends. Since 1850, this continues to be a problem. The legislation involving race is really interesting because of the many unintended consequences that it ends up having. Like I say, in some ways, it drove many companies out of the business, out of selling it to African Americans, and in that way created a space in which African American run companies that sold primarily to African Americans could spring up. Interestingly enough, though, they, in time, ended up charging the same rates that would have been considered discriminatory if a company was selling to African Americans and to other policyholders at the same time. The kind of research that comes out of this is also kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, that within the black companies and these various other companies, you get a lot of people arguing about why it is that African American mortality rates in the early 20th century appear to be fairly significantly higher. The thing to realize, though, is that choosing how to classify really matters and is to some extent fairly arbitrary. One could just as easily have looked at Irish mortality and found very similar rates at exactly the same time, and yet there was no discrimination because of Irish birth.